You don't really understand their size until you stand inside them. She slipped her hand into his for the walk back to the office. On the bulletin board near dispatch, somebody had pinned a new safety reporting poster with a direct hotline to the compliance committee. Beneath it, in smaller print, the policy now guaranteed protection from retaliation and independent review for documented concerns. Naomi read as much as her eyes could manage and asked, "Was that because of you?" Malcolm thought about Odessa, Lenora, Celia, Vanessa, Bill, the mechanics whose honest logs contradicted lies, the workers who endured bad write-ups before anyone strong enough stepped in, and the strange fact that change is almost never the product of one person alone even when one person becomes the visible hinge. "It was because a lot of people finally stopped acting scared at the same time," he said. Naomi nodded, as if that made perfect sense, which perhaps it did. By spring, Redstone's board formally sunset the covenant activation, not because Malcolm had lost interest in oversight but because the emergency had passed into structure. The hotline was permanent. Vendor verification controls were permanent. Records audit independence was permanent. Restored pay had been issued to every employee harmed by the manipulated discipline program, with letters in their files clarifying the write-ups were vacated for integrity failures, not merely administrative error. That distinction mattered to Malcolm. People deserve more than quiet correction when the system smears them. They deserve the record to admit it lied. The board asked one last time whether he would take an executive seat. Malcolm accepted a narrower role instead, chair of the Operational Ethics Committee for the Founder Network Terminals, part-time, paid fairly, with authority specific enough to matter and limited enough not to turn him into the kind of man who forgot what dock air smelled like at 4 a.m. He kept a hand in the floor, a hand in oversight, and both feet in the life he had built with Naomi, which still involved permission slips, grocery lists, forgotten sneakers, bedtime bargaining, and all the small domestic negotiations no title can replace. Power had entered his life publicly at last, but it had not improved on the private thing he valued most, which was being known at home without ceremony. If you've made it this far, let me say this. The most dangerous mistake a person like Gregory Sloan ever makes is believing quiet people are empty. They look at restraint and see weakness because noise is the only language they know how to measure. They look at working hands and think those hands could not possibly be holding anything larger than a time card. They look at a single father trying to get off in time for school lunch and assume his world is small because it bends around one child. But sometimes that child is exactly why the man does not bend at all. Sometimes responsibility makes a person calmer, not softer. Sometimes the one being walked out with a cardboard box is the only adult in the building who actually understands what the building is for. Malcolm never forgot the feel of the wind in that parking lot or the sound of Lenora Vance saying, "I'm filing the activation now." He never forgot how quickly the mythology of Gregory Sloan collapsed once facts were allowed into the room, or how many decent people had needed only one proof of consequence to stop pretending they were powerless. He never forgot, either, that he could have used the covenant earlier. He thought about that often, especially on the quiet drives between Naomi's school and the terminal when sunset turned the highway copper and temporary. He had believed patience was always virtue. What he learned instead was harder and more useful. Patience is a virtue only until it becomes permission for damage. After that, action is mercy wearing a sterner face. And Naomi, years later, would remember almost nothing about contracts, audits, metadata, bylaws, or shell vendors. She would remember that her father came to lunch on a Thursday when he was never supposed to be free. She would remember the way he sat on a cafeteria bench that felt too small for adults and peeled the orange she had packed for herself because she liked the way he did it better. She would remember that whatever happened at his job that morning did not keep him from showing up where he had promised to be. Children build their understanding of strength from moments like that, not headlines. Not board votes. Not indictments. A man can take over a company in the morning and still be measured most accurately by whether he makes it to school before noon. So when people say Gregory Sloan lost everything because Malcolm Tate made one phone call, that isn't exactly wrong. He lost the authority he abused. He lost the money stream he thought was hidden. He lost the reputation that had always depended on weaker people keeping his secrets for him. Eventually he lost his freedom, too. But the deeper truth is that Gregory began losing everything long before that parking lot call. He began losing it the first time he believed the man doing honest work in steel-toed boots was too ordinary to matter. He began losing it the first time he thought records were safer in his hands than in the hands of the people living inside their consequences. He began losing it the moment he mistook someone's decency for a lack of options. Malcolm's call simply allowed the bill to come due. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe to stand with those who speak truth to power. Because sometimes justice is loud, and sometimes it sounds like one calm sentence spoken into a phone in the cold by a father who has already decided that if truth has to come through him, then truth is exactly what's coming. Celia requested document metadata under a routine verification pretext and spent her lunch at her desk reading what the system told her. 3 of the 4 incident reports had been created within a 9-hour window 6 weeks earlier from a workstation registered to Gregory Sloane's executive login. 2 had been modified again just after midnight by an administrator credential mapped to his assistant. The incidents themselves were backdated to dates weeks before the files were even created. 1 witness statement template had been generated from a form library nobody in warehouse supervision used. In other words, the records had fingerprints all over them. Digital lies always do. Vanessa read the folder standing in Celia's office. She read it once, then again, slower. Her face changed not dramatically but decisively, the way a locked door changes when the bolt slides back. "How long have you had this?" she asked. Celia said, "Since yesterday." Vanessa looked up sharply. "Why did you wait?" Celia answered with the exact honesty the moment deserved. "Because Gregory Sloane is a regional executive, and I wanted to know whether I was bringing this to someone who would do the right thing with it or the safe thing with it." Vanessa stood still after that. Some truths do not require argument because the shame in them arrives fully formed. She took the folder to outside counsel that same afternoon, along with a written statement admitting she had questioned parts of Malcolm's file before signing it and had failed to escalate those doubts. Outside counsel accepted the materials, added them to the audit record, and told Vanessa only what process required. There would be a board session Monday, she would attend, and she should preserve every communication Gregory had sent regarding maintenance exceptions, discipline actions, and labor target directives. Vanessa went home that night and did not sleep much. People imagine regret as noisy. Most of the time it is silent and methodical, turning one decision over and over until you recognize the version of yourself that made it and realize you no longer want to live there. Monday's board meeting was scheduled for 8:30 at Redstone Logistics Group headquarters downtown, on the 22nd floor of a building Gregory Sloane had spent a year believing understood his value. He was told late Friday that senior regional leadership attendance was required for a governance review tied to operational compliance. Gregory did not ask many questions because men like him rarely expect ambiguity to contain danger for them personally. He arrived at 8:15 carrying a leather folio and the mild irritation of someone forced into early seriousness on behalf of other people's procedures. Inside the boardroom he found 7 directors already seated, outside counsel along the wall, 2 audit partners beside 4 bankers' boxes of records, Vanessa Price at the far end of the table looking like someone who had finally decided exhaustion was preferable to self-deception, and Celia Grant with a slim binder in front of her and a face so steady Gregory immediately understood, without yet understanding anything useful, that she had crossed some line he would rather have left intact. He was still deciding how to interpret that when the door opened again. Malcolm Tate walked in wearing a dark charcoal suit Gregory had never seen because Gregory had only ever built one version of Malcolm in his mind, and that version wore reflective tape, carried a radio, and existed for the convenience of people more important than himself. There is a particular kind of shock that comes not from surprise alone but from realizing that the assumptions you have used to organize another human being were not merely incomplete. They were the instrument of your own destruction. Gregory stood halfway without meaning to. Vanessa looked down. Celia looked directly at Malcolm and gave the smallest nod. At the head of the table, Board Chair Eleanor Shaw said, "Thank you all for coming. Most of you know Mr. Malcolm Tate as South River's overnight operations supervisor. What some of you may not fully understand is that Mr. Tate is also the current stewardship holder of the Odessa Tate Governance Covenant, tied to founder control provisions preserved during the Tate and Rail acquisition. That covenant was activated on Thursday following evidence of retaliatory termination connected to safety documentation and possible contract fraud. Effective immediately, Mr. Tate holds temporary controlling vote authority over South River regional operations pending completion of the independent review." Gregory made a sound before he found words. "That's not possible." Eleanor did not raise her voice. "It is entirely possible. In fact, it is documented in the bylaws you signed acknowledgement of when you joined the company." Gregory slammed his hand on the table, trying to regain control. "This is a legal ambush. A decades-old clause cannot override active executive decisions or clear employee misconduct." Malcolm said, quietly, "I didn't need to disclose it to supervise a doc. I only needed to use it if the company started punishing people for keeping accurate records." Gregory turned to Vanessa with the speed of instinct. "You signed the termination," he said, his voice tightening as panic set in. "You validated every word. If I go down, you go down for endorsing it." Vanessa met his eyes for the first time in days without flinching. "I signed a document I should have stopped. Then I corrected that failure. The metadata is in front of you, Gregory. Your login created the files." Celia slid the binder toward him. Gregory opened it, his fingers visibly shaking as he searched for a loophole, but the room watched his face move through denial, calculation, and the total collapse of his defense. Audit summaries on Iron Crest billing sat underneath the metadata. So did internal emails centralizing maintenance exceptions through his office. So did a conflict of interest report revealing Iron Crest Fleet Solutions had been incorporated by Gregory's college roommate's wife 5 weeks before the first Redstone contract. Over 13 months, the shell company had billed for repairs already performed internally, invoiced emergency callouts on holidays when terminals were closed, and collected payments routed through layered accounts that outside auditors had already begun tracing. The board voted within 23 minutes to suspend Gregory Sloan from all authority, freeze payments connected to Iron Crest and associated vendors, refer the maintenance contracts for criminal review, and authorize full access to every disciplinary action issued in South River during Gregory's tenure. Malcolm did not speak often during that first section of the meeting. He did not need to. The facts had arrived more completely than anger ever could. When Eleanor finally turned to him and asked what he wanted the company to do next, Malcolm rested both hands on the table and answered without consulting a note. "First," he said, "every write-up tied to attendance, productivity, or safety under Gregory's labor reduction directive gets reviewed by an independent team, not local management. Anybody who lost hours or promotion eligibility based on manipulated discipline gets made whole with back pay and restored standing." He paused only long enough to be certain nobody in the room mistook this for rhetoric. "Second, maintenance verification changes now. No vendor invoice gets cleared unless the floor confirms service completion and asset condition. Mechanics sign it. Operations signs it. Accounts payable can wait." He looked at the audit boxes, then back at the board. "Third, any employee at any terminal in this region needs a direct reporting line to the compliance committee that does not route through the people being reported. Anonymous if necessary. Protected by policy if not. If workers had a way around Gregory, we wouldn't be sitting here because he wouldn't have lasted this long." The room was quiet in the useful way, the way people go quiet when something undeniable has just been said by the one person who paid the highest price to earn the right to say it. Eleanor nodded. "And your role in all this going forward?" Malcolm looked at the windows for a moment. Downtown traffic far below moved with the indifferent certainty of a world that has no idea somebody's life is changing on the 22nd floor of a tower. "My grandmother built a switch for emergencies," he said. "I used it because the slow ways stopped working. I'm not interested in living in this boardroom. I am interested in making sure the people doing the actual work stop paying for executive theft. It was not the kind of statement consultants quote on slides because it had not been designed to sound good. It had been designed to be true. The review took 3 weeks. 6 disciplinary actions tied to Gregory's labor cuts were overturned in the first 4 days. Then 11 more. Then productivity metrics at 2 terminals were found to have been manipulated by reclassifying safety pauses as idle time. Iron Crest's invoices turned into a forest of nonsense the deeper investigators went: duplicate line items, serial numbers for parts never manufactured, technician names tied to expired licenses, mileage claims on trucks that did not exist, emergency refrigeration callouts billed during thunderstorms severe enough to close the yard gates entirely. Gregory's college roommate's wife, listed on incorporation documents, cooperated almost immediately when investigators showed up with bank transfers and signature records. Within a month prosecutors had enough for fraud charges, wire counts, and obstruction tied to document manipulation. Gregory, who had spent a career weaponizing process, discovered at last that process becomes a crueler instrument when the people running it are not on your side. Vanessa Price was appointed interim regional director 16 days after the meeting, but only after Malcolm required the board resolution appointing her to begin with a sentence of his own drafting: operational authority exists to protect the work, not to dominate the worker. Some directors disliked the language because it sounded too plain. Malcolm insisted on it for exactly that reason. Plain language is harder to hide behind. Vanessa accepted the position knowing fully that her promotion was not reward but responsibility. She visited South River the first Monday after the announcement and met privately with every shift lead who wanted 15 minutes. She apologized to Malcolm in person in a warehouse conference room with bad coffee and fluorescent lights that made everybody look more tired than they were. She did not ask forgiveness. She said, "I saw the crack in the story and chose the safer side of it. I won't do that again." Malcolm studied her long enough to decide whether the sentence belonged to ambition or regret. "Then don't," he said. It was not absolution. It was a door left unclosed. Naomi found out the broad version on a Sunday afternoon while coloring at the kitchen table. Children accept extraordinary information far more cleanly than adults because they have not yet invested so much in the rules of status that they need several days to recover when the rules fail. Malcolm told her, carefully, that the company Grandma Odessa built a long time ago had left him a responsibility, and that he had needed to use it because someone at work had lied and hurt people. Naomi thought about that while filling in the blue roof of a warehouse she had drawn. "So you're like the backup boss?" she asked. Malcolm laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh, surprised into existence. "Something like that." Naomi nodded, satisfied. "Okay. Are you still coming to my reading night on Thursday?" Malcolm looked at her and felt the whole architecture of his life arrange itself around what mattered. "Yes," he said. "No matter what else happens, yes." Naomi went back to coloring. For her, the essential governance question had already been answered. When the indictment became public 6 weeks later, South River workers read it on their phones during breaks and handed screens to one another like proof that gravity still functioned. 11 fraud counts. 3 obstruction counts. Conspiracy exposure for affiliated shell entities. Gregory's photograph on local business news looked smaller somehow, as though even cameras knew he no longer occupied the same amount of moral space. Malcolm did not celebrate. Satisfaction is not the same thing as joy, and he had never been a man who confused the two. He read the article once, closed his phone, and went to Naomi's school concert where she played 12 uncertain notes on a clarinet and then found him in the crowd as if that had always been the point of music. Winter came down harder by December. The yard lights at South River cast pale halos over breath and diesel vapor. Malcolm returned one Saturday morning, not for a shift but because Naomi wanted to see the place that got all dramatic. He walked her through the terminal wearing a company visitor badge that made several employees grin every time they looked at it. He showed her the loading bays, the reefer monitors, the line where outbound manifests printed, the old bay door motor Louise had repaired 3 times before Gregory ever paid a ghost vendor to pretend otherwise. Naomi moved through the place with solemn curiosity, absorbing the scale of the machinery her father had spent years navigating in steel-toed boots while she imagined him only as the man who packed lunches and searched for missing library books. At the end of aisle C she stopped, turned slowly under the warehouse lights, and said, "It's way bigger than it feels when you talk about it at home." Malcolm put one hand on the rail beside him and smiled. "Most hard things are," he said. The phone call lasted 3 minutes and 58 seconds. Malcolm Tate made it from the far edge of the employee lot behind Redstone Cargo's South River Terminal, standing beside his pickup in the bitter wind with a cardboard box on the hood and his termination packet tucked under one arm as if it weighed less than it actually did. He had been calm in the conference room when Gregory Sloan read the violations off the printed sheet in a voice so polished it sounded rehearsed. He had been calm when Vanessa Price initialed the bottom line without lifting her eyes long enough to study his face. He had been calm when security waited while he emptied his locker and chose, with a levelness that unsettled the guard more than anger would have, which 3 things were worth carrying out by hand and which could stay behind forever. He took the framed school photo of his daughter Naomi where her front tooth had just come in crooked. He took the heavy flashlight his mother had bought him the year he started night shift because she said every honest man deserved to see what was in front of him. And he took the black pocket notebook he had filled over 6 years with dates, trailer numbers, incident notes, brake complaints, refrigeration failures, seal mismatches, and the names of supervisors who preferred certain truths to be misplaced before sunrise. Then he walked into the November cold, where his breath came visible in front of him and the metal fence along the perimeter rattled in the wind, and he made a call from a number he had never once used on company property before that morning. A woman answered on the first ring. Her name was Lenora Vance. Malcolm said, very simply, "It happened." There was no tremor in his voice, and somehow that made the sentence hit harder. Lenora was quiet for half a second, the kind of quiet that belongs to people who have spent years waiting for one sentence and hoping they will never hear it. Then she said, "Were you formally terminated for cause?" Malcolm looked down at the packet in his hand. "Yes." Lenora said, "Do you have the signed notice?" Malcolm said, "I do." Lenora drew one breath and answered with the same calm a surgeon might use before the first cut. "Understood. I'm filing the activation now." Malcolm thanked her. He ended the call. He stood by his truck another moment while forklifts moved somewhere beyond the loading doors and men inside finished the morning unload without having any idea that the company they worked for had already begun changing hands. Then Malcolm got in his pickup, set the cardboard box on the passenger seat, and drove across town to Naomi's middle school because she had been asking him for almost 4 months to come eat lunch with her on a Thursday instead of promising he would and then getting trapped by a double shift, and on that day, for the first time in a long while, nobody at Redstone Cargo had the power to keep him from saying yes. Before we step deeper into how this single phone call dismantled an empire, if you stand with quiet people who turn corporate boardrooms upside down, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your city in the comments below so I know where this story reaches tonight. Now let's get straight back into it. Because stories like this are never only about revenge, they are about what happens when a decent man finally decides that protecting his child, his crew, and the truth matters more than keeping anybody comfortable. Malcolm Tate was 41 years old and had worked at Redstone Cargo for 8 years, first as a yard checker, then as a dock lead, and for the last 5 as overnight operations supervisor, which was the kind of title that sounded respectable in a meeting and translated in real life to fixing every problem that happened after executives went home. He knew which forklift coughed before the transmission slipped. He knew which drivers kept spare gloves under their seats and which ones pretended not to be tired because they needed the overtime too badly to admit it. He knew which warehouse lights on row C cut out in heavy rain and how long you could trust the reefer temperature on bay 11 before the digital reading started lying. He knew every birthday that mattered to the people under him because he understood something that every good floor supervisor learned sooner or later: operations are made of systems on paper and people in real life, and the people are always the part that breaks first when management decides to worship the paper. He was not loud. He was not imposing. He was not one of those men who needed his name to arrive before he did. But he was the person everybody on that terminal floor looked for when something serious happened, because he knew what to do, and because panic tended to move around him without finding anything to stick to. Nobody at Redstone Cargo knew anything about the covenant. 24 years earlier, long before Redstone became a national logistics brand with investor presentations and polished executive headshots, the South River Terminal had belonged to a regional freight company called Tate and Rail, founded by Malcolm's grandmother, Odessa Tate, with 2 leased trucks, 1 borrowed loading ramp, and a conviction so stubborn people mistook it for rudeness. Odessa built that company route by route across 3 states, hiring drivers nobody else wanted, refusing to run unsafe equipment, and teaching her family that the fastest way to become useless in business was to stop being able to recognize the people who made your money for you. When a larger holding company acquired Tate and Rail, Odessa agreed to the sale only after forcing language into the deal that the corporate attorneys described, at the time, as excessive, eccentric, and probably unnecessary. Odessa did not care what they called it. She reserved a block of founder control shares inside a private governance covenant that could transfer temporary voting authority if there was documented executive retaliation tied to safety complaints, falsified records, or labor suppression at any terminal descended from the original Tate and Rail network. It was not advertised. It was not discussed in quarterly calls. It sat like a loaded switch inside the company's legal architecture, dormant for years, then decades, because Odessa believed emergency powers were like fire axes, visible enough that responsible people stayed honest, but used only when the building was already burning. When Odessa died, the stewardship passed to Malcolm's mother. When Malcolm's mother died, it passed to him. The paperwork was airtight, the activation conditions narrow, the disclosure obligations almost non-existent. As long as he did not exploit his operational role for personal financial advantage, he did not have to walk into Redstone and announce that the quiet man in the reflective vest logging dock temperatures after midnight could, under very specific circumstances, seize control of the board's voting balance before lunch. Malcolm kept it private not because he enjoyed secrets but because he had learned from his grandmother that titles distort rooms. The moment people know who can ruin them, they stop showing you what they would do if they thought you could not. Malcolm wanted to know exactly how things worked when nobody was performing ethics for an audience. Then Gregory Sloan arrived. The fraud had not begun with Gregory Sloan, but it flourished under him because some men do not create corruption so much as provide it with climate control. 3 months after Gregory took over South River, an outside contractor called Iron Crest Fleet Solutions began winning no-bid emergency service approvals for refrigeration units, hydraulic lifts, dock doors, and yard tractors across the region. The contracts appeared legitimate. The paperwork carried license numbers, tax forms, signatures, and service windows. Gregory approved each one under a maintenance exception he had lobbied to centralize through his office. Over 13 months, Iron Crest billed Redstone nearly $1.6 million. The problem was that the actual maintenance on most of the equipment continued to be performed by Redstone's in-house mechanics working overtime, covering failures they were told to log internally so invoiced vendor work could still be recognized against budget allocations. On paper, Iron Crest fixed everything. In reality, mechanics named Luis and Jerome and May and Carl were doing those repairs with company parts on company time while Gregory signed vendor invoices for work nobody from Iron Crest had ever shown up to perform. Malcolm knew something was wrong long before he could map the entire shape of it, because his notebook told him that Bay Door 7 had been repaired twice by Luis during a month an invoice claimed Iron Crest had replaced the entire motor assembly, and because reefer unit RT-114 had 3 nighttime temperature failures after a vendor bill described a full service overhaul completed that same week. Lies rarely become visible all at once. They start by disagreeing with the people who actually had to touch the machinery. For 11 weeks Gregory watched Malcolm's documentation grow. Then he decided documentation was easier to remove than fraud. The violations used to fire Malcolm were cleanly constructed, bureaucratic, and false in the way only administrative lies can be false. A temperature excursion report for a pharmaceutical trailer allegedly showed Malcolm failing to respond for 46 minutes on a night he had been covering 2 departments after one supervisor called out sick. A seal discrepancy report on an electronics load carried his digital confirmation at an hour when terminal camera logs later proved he had been off-site taking Naomi to urgent care for an ear infection. A forklift safety checklist showed a missing brake inspection bearing Malcolm's initials on a date he had been at jury duty, a fact recorded in payroll. 2 witness statements from warehouse associates described Malcolm instructing staff to bypass a hazardous materials protocol, except both named employees had been scheduled at a different terminal that week. Anybody willing to look carefully could have seen the problems. Gregory's bet was that nobody with the authority to stop him would want to look that carefully if he moved fast enough and wrapped the lie in policy. Vanessa Price signed the termination authorization on a Tuesday evening. Malcolm was called into conference room B at 9:10 on Thursday morning. Gregory read the allegations without emotion. Vanessa sat beside him, posture correct, pen aligned with the folder edge, face composed into the neutral expression ambitious people wear when they are trying to survive the consequences of a decision they did not fully own but did not stop. Malcolm listened to each violation the way some men listen to weather reports, attentive, unimpressed, aware the storm exists whether or not the language describing it is accurate. When Gregory finished, Malcolm asked for copies of the documentation and underlying system entries. Gregory said those would be available only through formal appeal. Malcolm asked whether the witness statements had been notarized. Gregory said that question was irrelevant at this stage. Malcolm nodded once, looked at Vanessa, and said, "You know at least one of those dates is impossible." Vanessa did not answer. Gregory said, "Your access is terminated effective immediately." Malcolm folded the packet, stood, shook Vanessa's hand before she could decide whether she deserved that grace, and left the room without offering Gregory the same courtesy. The call to Lenora Vance was what Malcolm did next. Lenora had been general counsel to Odessa Tate during the acquisition years and now served as independent trustee for the Covenant Odessa built into Redstone's parent structure. She was 72, sharp as cold metal, and had spent long enough around corporate power to distinguish immediately between inconvenience and rot. Malcolm had spoken with her only twice in the previous decade, both times to update beneficiary records and once to confirm that the covenant remained enforceable after a merger changed holding company names. Lenora never called unless necessary, never dramatized anything, and never forgot what documents were designed to do when ordinary character failed. When Malcolm sent her a photo of the termination notice and the scanned allegations from his truck, the covenant's trigger criteria became more than theoretical. A formal retaliatory discharge connected to documented safety inconsistencies was exactly the scenario Odessa had prepared for. By 10:17 that morning, Lenora had filed notice with Redstone Logistics Group's board chair, the company secretary, outside counsel, and the compliance committee. By 11 o'clock, the covenant's emergency governance provision had temporarily shifted controlling vote authority over South River regional operations to the founder stewardship seat Malcolm held. By 11:30, an independent audit firm was granted access to maintenance contracts, personnel discipline records, and metadata history connected to Malcolm's termination. Her name was Celia Grant, and she was 34, technically a senior HR systems analyst, though most executives still thought of her as the quiet one in personnel who knows the software. Celia had joined Redstone after 6 years in records management for a hospital network and had developed a private rule that anyone who was too confident around employee history logs probably had a reason to be. She processed Malcolm's exit file late Thursday morning and felt, before she could explain why, that the timestamps around the incident packet were wrong in the way counterfeit money is wrong to cashiers before the pen touches the bill. Gregory's packet contained 4 discipline items created from 3 separate systems, yet the internal export formatting matched a batch poll rather than contemporaneous record generation.